Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the IBMS Support Hub for transitioning across to ISO 15189. It's lovely to have you all join us this afternoon, and thank you for taking the time. I'm going to waffle on for the first 5 minutes or so, just to give everybody an opportunity to join the call, and we'll watch those numbers go up in the corner of the screen. I'm hoping everyone can see my screen okay. Mark, can I just confirm that you can still see that?
Yes, I can see that.
Fab, that's brilliant. Thank you ever so much. Okay, so really just to kind of review why we're here today, we have a series of 3 sessions with the support of colleagues at UKAS to help our members go through that process of transitioning to the 2022 version of 15189. This process started the Support Hub started a couple of months ago when we hosted our first one with Al Bryant supporting from UKAS and talking us through the gap analysis, and then Nigel Coles, one of my colleagues from Council, talking us through risk and risk-based thinking. For those of you that weren't able to join, firstly, you missed a fantastic session that gave us some really, really helpful updates on the transition, where we were up to gap analysis and risk, as I say, and the recording of that is now available on the IBMS website, so that if you want to go back and have a look at it, please do take the time to do so. I'm sure you'll find it hugely, hugely helpful. Moving forward, today we have Mark with us, and I'll introduce Mark a little further in a second, and he's going to talk through really where we're up to, so that further update on progression towards transition, and also run through some of the trends that as assessment providers from UKAS have seen throughout that process, and things for us to kind of look out for. We'll then also hand across to Jonathan Boxshall, and again, I'll introduce him in a second, as a technical assessor to provide some of the things that he's also witnessed as he's undertaken some of his first visits, but also an opportunity for us to tell us how he's been able to apply some of those into practice in delivering his role as quality manager in Northumbria. So that's today's session. Mark's also then going to talk to us about LIMS. I think we've had lots of questions about laboratory information management systems and how they go through that transition process, especially because a huge number of us are either just delivering our LIMS or about to go through that process of the huge change to the way we manage resulting and result transmission, and so really looking at that as part of the process as well. And then, as usual, we will open it up to you guys for a question and answer. So please use either the chat or the Q&A. I'll keep an eye on those and pull those questions together and help facilitate that Q&A session towards the end of today's event. If we just look forward as well, our third session in the programme, it may not be our last. And again, if there are particular areas you would like us to cover working alongside our UKAS colleagues, please do let us know. We are here to support you as much as we possibly can with transition across to the new version of the standard. But session 3 is currently listed for the 4th of September. So once you've all had your summer holidays, and we'll go through with John Ringrow point of care testing and what the new standard means for point of care testing. So with no further ado, some introductions, and rudely I haven't introduced myself, although I kind of think most people probably know who I am by now. So Debra Padgett, past president of the Institute of Biomedical Science, but always had a fond place in my heart for quality management. And I've done a lot of work with quality over my 22 years in the profession. Then we have Mark, who's on screen with me currently, who's a senior assessment manager at UKAS and also serves as a technical focus person for microbiology. Not biased in any way, shape or form, Mark, but microbiology, the best discipline in pathology, obviously. Jonathan's booing in the background. And then Jonathan Boxshall, this is the best photo I could find of Jonathan and his excessive marathon running, who is a haematology and blood transfusion biomedical scientist and now pathology quality manager in Northumbria. but as I've mentioned, is also a technical assessor for UKAS and is also a module tutor on our CEP for quality management. So with no further ado, Mark, I am going to stop sharing and I'm going to hand across to you to give us a bit of an update, and then hopefully we'll have Jonathan able to share his slides. Otherwise, he's going to swap seats with me and deliver it from this seat. So over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me just sort this screen sharing out. Is that okay there? Can you see the presentation okay?
Working perfectly, yes.
Lovely, thank you. Excellent, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the introduction there as well. I was just rather worrying and looking at that picture of myself on the thing. I seem to notice I've got a lot more hair on that picture than I do now, but it is because I did shave it last week and the light is reflecting on there. So it's nothing to do with any hair loss during the transition and the stress of that. So yeah, I've been asked today to come along and do a little an update from the talk that Al did earlier in the year, back in April. I work quite closely with Al in doing some of the sort of technical areas. So I was asked just to give a general update on where we are as regards things like trend analysis. So I'm just going to very quickly cover some of the background to the transition and the UKAS process, not in any great detail because Al did cover this in the previous assessment, but just really to give a little bit of an update on the transition and where it is and some of the trends that we are seeing from the transition assessment. So particularly around some of the non-conformities that we're seeing there. So moving quickly on now, anyone who was at the previous session that Al did will probably recognise this slide. So this is just a comment that you know, as everyone knows, ISO 15189 was republished in December of 2022, and that sort of kicked off a 3-year transition process. We've heard much about this, and we're all very well aware that there's much more focus now on clinical risk and patient impact and patient management. So the first year of the transition was last year. That was more about us putting the gap analysis together, training our assessors, making everybody, customers and assessors, aware of what was going to be happening, and working with professional bodies, including the IBMS. 2024, where we are now, this is the in some regards the pivotal year of it, because this is where the vast majority of the transition assessments will be taking place. So anyone who's got their routine surveillance or reassessment will be having a transition assessment at the same time. And then the intention is to finish the transition by the end of 2025. So that gives us a bit of a buffer time, if you like, to do any sort of admin work, granting any decisions to award all the grants for accreditation, and then also looking at any labs that need a second transition assessment. So just to touch on the transition process, again, I'm sure most of you will be familiar with this, or only a very quick look at this. So there's various information on the UKAS website and all sorts of other publications around the transition process. It's really down to laboratories to complete their gap analysis and submit that to UKAS. This is being assessed remotely by the UKAS assessment manager or the lead assessor specifically, so there's no technical assessor involvement at this stage. This is being done remotely, generally about 4 weeks before the assessment, and we will then follow up any queries on site. I'll come to that a little bit more on the next slide. Any non-conformities relating to the transition are obviously recorded as they normally would. We are separating transition findings and normal surveillance findings at the minute, so we can maintain labs accreditation to 2012 in the meantime. But once all your findings are cleared to 2022, then you can then proceed towards the grant of accreditation to the 2022 standard. Now, some labs have asked about the impact on the accreditation cycle. So it's really just to reinforce that once you've had your transition assessment, there is no impact on the 4-year accreditation cycle. So wherever you are in that, whether it's surveillance 1, 2, or 3, you will continue in that and move to the next assessment in the following year. And also the accreditation expiry dates are unchanged as well. So there's no going back to the start of the cycle again. We will just continue where you are. So yeah, we're well into the transition now. We're approaching sort of the halfway point in the year. It is proceeding well overall, but there are some sort of issues that we're seeing and some trends that are just sort of worthy of mention. lots of laboratories are at different stages. Some of them are proceeding very well with this, some are having some difficulties, and we have had a number of requests from labs to postpone their transition assessments. We don't want to make a habit of this. We've looked at particular examples in very extreme circumstances, but as I've explained, you know, we've got until the end of next year essentially to complete this transition. So labs that are requesting their transitions to take place to next year, it is just very, very difficult to do that, because you know, once one starts doing it, everybody starts doing it, and simply wouldn't be enough time to get through all the transitions and get all the decision making done. So really, we do need to get those transition assessments done by the end of this year. We also just need to make clear on that we are assessing implementation of 2022. It's not about the intention to implement. So we do need to see that laboratories are making progress with this. Now, something that's come out from some of the early assessments, and we may need to do a little bit more, have a bit more discussion on this, is that although we are looking for implementation of the standard, it doesn't necessarily mean that labs need to make sure every single document and every process has been updated to reflect the new standard. As people have seen from the gap analysis, there are there are major changes, moderate changes, and minor changes. So I think that the best practice really is for labs to sort of prioritise these on a risk base. So starting with the major gaps and looking at those first, then moving down to the moderate gaps, and those are the two where the biggest changes can be seen. So using a risk-based approach to address those. But we do need to make sure that you do also look at the minor gaps. So even though there is a risk-based approach, you know, be careful not to ignore the minor changes, because they will get looked at to some extent. They're not getting a lot of transition assessment, but they will be getting some attention. And some of these gap analyses have been received very late. I think some labs are at different stages of where they are with proceeding with this, or some have either come in very late or they've come in incomplete. Do appreciate that some assessments have been booked at short notice, which hasn't helped, and we are stopping that now. We are wanting all assessments to be booked at least a month in advance, and ideally much more than that. So yeah, if you could make sure those gap analyses are complete when they are sent in, that's very helpful. As I say, we're not allocating specific time for looking at this on site. You know, there's extra effort for the initial remote review. So we are really just building it into the surveillance and reassessments that are ongoing. So we do need to tweak what is done on those individual assessments, and you know, John may have a bit more detail on that. But if the gap analysis has been completed as full as possible, and then records are ready to show the assessors on site, then that's very helpful, and it can help the whole process proceed much quicker. So just looking at the non-conformities and things that we've seen so far, some figures are showing that there's an average of 14 mandatory actions and 2 recommendations per customer. So that's per assessment. So that's spread over them all. Obviously, some will have more than that and some will have less than that. So without looking at any specific numbers, we have sort of done a little bit of trend analysis on these, and the table there that you can see shows the highest ranking non-conformities, if you like, so the highest level trends starting at the top. So there's no specific numbers on there. We've got the actual clauses and then the areas from 1 to 8, where we are seeing the most non-conformities, obviously with number 1 being the highest. Some of these I've written at the top there. Some of them are potentially surprising. There are aspects where they've been in the standard for a long time. We're very familiar with them, and I do believe, speaking as a technical assessor, that we have been assessing to this sort of level even during 2012. Some of the areas that are in 2022 we have already looked at as part of 2012. They're just made a lot more explicit now in 2022. They're spelled out a lot more, so you know, it's much clearer what the what is required. So although they're new in that regard, so some of them potentially, yeah, we have looked at them before, and I will just go through some of those during the course of this presentation. So the top one there, 7.3. So this is the examination processes section. So this is the largest area of where the non-conformities are being found. It's a very large area of the standard as well. It includes a lot of the key technical areas. So it's got validation, verification, uncertainty, and all the quality assurance. So in that regard, it's perhaps not surprising at all that this is where the most non-conformities are being seen. But as I say, they are well-established areas, but there are some changes in there, as we know. There are mostly sort of moderate changes within this area. So things like considering the clinical application of the test, you know, why clinically are you using a particular test and not a different test? Looking at things like reagent lot-to-lot variation, so making sure that you don't change your IQC material when you're changing your reagents, so you can spot any trends in reagent lots. Frequency of quality control, and also the quality control materials used, so things that are spelled out a lot more in 2022. Now, within this 7.3, the key area seems to be clause 737, which is the ensuring validity of results. This is classed as a moderate change on the gap analysis. Now looking within that sort of sub-clause, there's no specific trend in there. The findings that we've seen have been generally spread around in that area. So we're seeing findings around IQC being performed at clinical decision levels, lack of justification for specific EQA schemes, or why using one EQA scheme and not another one, and also a lack of consideration for use of third-party controls. That's one of these where I say could be considered surprising. I'm sure you'll all be familiar with conversations around the use of third-party controls. There's not an awful lot changed in the standard as regards that, but it is something which is still coming up quite a lot. And it really just requires labs to justify a lot more why they're using the controls that they are. 732, so this is the other area of the 7.3 clause where we're seeing a number of non-conformities. So this is the verification of examination methods. Again, it's rated as moderate on the gap analysis, so there have been some changes from 2012. But it is also a well-established area, and I know we did touch on this on a presentation I did at the IBMS Congress last year, looking specifically at the changes to verification and the new requirements. So some of the key areas here are things like clinical involvement in verification. So some of those that we're seeing have got a lack of clinical sign-off. They're very technically focused and not looking at the clinical implications of the assays that you're using and getting clinical involvement in the verification and sign-off. Also a lack of records around competency assessment. So I'll come to this a little bit more on the next slide. So there is now this requirement that people performing verifications are actually aware of what is required, almost being competency assessed and trained in doing verifications and being authorised to sign off verifications as well. And then similarly, lack of consideration of clinical decision making. So again, getting clinical staff involved in the verifications, supporting why you are choosing this particular method and not another one. Now, I do appreciate that showing implementation of this may require some performing of verifications. It may be that some labs haven't actually done any verifications at this stage. So we do need to be a little bit pragmatic here. I'm not particularly looking at assessed laboratories to be going back and redoing verifications and showing evidence of clinical sign-off. And if you know, so do bear that in mind. We just need to be assured that actually you're aware of the requirements, and that future verifications that you're doing or any ongoing verifications, that they will meet the requirements of standard and include things like the clinical approval and the authorization for sign-off. Skip to slide there. 6.2, so the breakdown here, this is the personnel section. There's two clauses here which seem to be coming out as still getting quite a few non-conformities. So one of them I touched on already there. So this is clause 6.2.3, which is around authorization. Again, this is a new area in 2022. And this is authorization for performing specific activities. So we're looking for people who've got authorization to do verifications, as I mentioned, authorization to be involved with the LIMS system and making updates to that. And linked in with this one, clause 622, which is competency requirements, another moderate change, although of course we are all very familiar with competency assessments and the requirements there. The standard now talks about competence for performing specific functions which influence results. So it's really around laboratories identifying what are these areas that have changed. Are there specific areas where we've not done a competency assessment before, but actually they do influence results? And this does fit in with the above, the one about verification and the LIMS. Assessments so far, we're seeing some lack of evidence for staff being trained in some of these activities. This really requires sort of some of the competency assessment records to be updated. Laboratories to identify any activities where they currently don't have any formal records of training and competency assessment. I do think this is one area that where we could actually demonstrate that it has been implemented. Obviously, laboratories are updating competency assessments quite frequently, so it should be possible for labs to show that this has been implemented and not just intentional. So I think this could be why we are getting a number of non-conformities in this area. Clause 7.8, continuity and emergency preparedness. Now, this is an interesting one because it is classed as a minor change from 2012. It's all about having your continuity plans in place, identifying any risks, testing of your continuity plans, and then coming up with any actions, training staff in how to manage these. I think one of the reasons why this may be coming up, because we are seeing a number of non-conformities around the lack of evidence that testing has been done. So laboratories have got contingency plans in place, but not showing that they've actually tested all the key areas of it. And I do think this might be because, although it was in the 2012 standard, it was sort of buried away a little bit under the lab director clause. So even though it's a minor change, it has been brought out into the open with its own dedicated clause. And so I think it's just getting that little bit more attention. It's a little bit more in front of you than it was before when it was within 2012. Clause 8.8, so I had a look at the non-conformities within that. So most of them seem to be coming around 883, which is internal audits. Another area potentially surprising, that because we've been assessing audits for obviously a long time, labs are getting much more familiar with the requirements for this. But it is classed as a moderate change. And what we're seeing is that there's a lack of evidence to this risk-based approach to auditing. So policies and procedures are not necessarily being updated to reflect how the audit schedule is developed and using a risk-based approach. And this may well be because laboratories are still sort of very much focused on auditing their full scope of service in a year or 2 years, and making sure each analyzer is audited, but really moving away from that. I see examples, I put neuroassays at the bottom there. We do see examples where laboratories might do an extension to scope and implement some new procedures, but actually put it at the back of the audit schedule and audit it in 12 months' time. Well, you could argue it's a higher risk, and so it should come forward into the audit schedule. So yeah, do have a look at your audit schedules there and have a think about the risk-based approach to that. A few more minor ones here. So clause 7.2, pre-examination procedures. No particular trend within the trend, if you like, here. There's a variety of sub-clauses. Some of them are minor changes, some of them are moderate changes. We are seeing a few non-conformities around patient consent or deviations from collection procedures, but nothing that particularly stands out. Similar with clause 7.4, which is the post-examination procedures. These are also minor changes, but most of the non-conformities that we're seeing here seem to be falling within 7.4.1, which is about reporting results. There is a potential trend here about the reporting of referral lab reports, especially when they're included within routine laboratory and in-house tests. So that could be one area to have a look at and revisit the standard for the requirements of that. And then the final set, again, two potentially surprising ones, clause 6.6. So this is reagents and consumables, a variety of minor and moderate changes here. Now, looking at the non-conformities, most of them seem to be around acceptance testing, an area which we're all familiar with now, but it is classed as a moderate change in the gap analysis because they have just tweaked the wording slightly. So it now talks about, it's added that you can do acceptance testing before the release of results. So it is an area that we are quite familiar with, but we are seeing some findings around there. Having a look at some of the ones that have been raised, I've seen consumables mentioned a few times. So although acceptance testing of consumables was in 2012, it may be that labs are thinking about this a little bit more now, and so the assessors are more focused on that. But I've also seen some findings around specific examples and gaps in acceptance testing records. Now, this is one of these areas where, if you've got gaps in your acceptance testing, it could well be that finding is more appropriate for the surveillance assessment. So we perhaps should be raising findings like that against the surveillance and not against the transition. So this is something we're having a little look at the minute to see whether we are we are seeing findings raised against the transition when in fact they should be going against the actual surveillance assessment. But one other potential area of trend here is around field safety notices. We're certainly getting quite a few findings about how laboratories are managing those. And the final trend within there is non-conforming work, incident management. This again is classed as moderate on the gap analysis. The findings seem to be mainly around the consideration of clinical risk. We're seeing lots of comments that there's no risk to patients from a particular incident, but actually there's no justification from that. So I think going forward, it may need a little bit more detail around, you know, rather than just assuming there's no clinical risk there and there's been no risk on patient management, actually having a good look at that to see whether there's some more detail that could be added. So yeah, just in a summary, the transition is proceeding generally well. You know, we are making our way through the assessments, but there are some areas that are still sort of don't seem quite fully understood. We're seeing a bit of a mixture in the way labs are progressing with this, both in terms of the numbers of findings, but also with the level of implementation. And we do need to see a degree of implementation here. There are some trends being seen, but some of these are around areas which have long been a focus. They are classed as moderate changes on the gap analysis, but they are areas that we are familiar with, such as verification and quality assurance. So yeah, we do have a fair way to go yet, but we are continuing to work with our assessors. We are looking at things like these incident trends, and if we're seeing things which maybe perhaps are more applicable to a surveillance than a transition, that we actually communicate that to our assessors. And that is everything. So thank you very much for that. Let me work out how to come out of this now.
Just like that. Thank you ever so much, Mark. That was really, really helpful, and a brilliant update on some of the things and the trends that you're seeing across the assessments that you've done so far. As you say, we're still a long way to go. There's still a lot of labs to be assessed, but as much information as we can provide to our members and the pathology community more broadly to help with that process, then that's what we're here to try and do today. We're a little quiet in the Q&A, folks. I'm sure we have some questions that you want to make the most of when we've got Mark present, and Jonathan and I, if I can. So please make the most of the Q&A, and we'll start to compile some of those. In the meantime, Mark, you can grab a cup of tea quickly, and we'll move across to Jonathan. Have you got your camera working? Yay, just like that. And do you want to share your presentation, please?
Want's a strong word, but I will. Right, hang on, just get my screens lined up. Good afternoon, everybody. Deborah's already done my introduction, so I am actually a jobbing quality manager and Deputy Debra in our trust. But yes, I am endlessly harassed now by UKAS to do more and more assessment visits, because we're obviously trying to keep up to date with them getting through these transitions. So I'm going to do a sort of half and half presentation, because I've just had one of my laboratories, microbiology, go through our first transition visit for our trust, Northumbria, so I can give you a little perspective from both sides. That moving forwards from there. Yeah. Yes. Okay, so from my UKAS technical assessing side, so I've done 2 different assessments, and I've also attended a meeting with all the technical assessors as well, where we had a discussion, and I presented at that again, just talking about how we were approaching technical assessing and any issues and what have you. So just to sort of give you an aspect from my side, so when we're doing the technical assessment, we're getting the pre-visit documentation like we always used to, like the SOPs, etc. But we're also now getting the gap analysis document. So what, as Mark said, so the assessment managers normally looked at this, gone through your gap analysis, highlighted things that they may need to look at, highlighted things that we as technical assessors may need to address, and said, right, so Jonathan, can you on this assessment make sure you look at this bit here, because we just need to make sure they're compliant with the standard. So we do all that, do the usual review of documents, and that's all the SOPs, etc. So we still do that. That's all part of your normal standard assessment. So I usually will read everything and probably be coming into the laboratory with a few questions before we even start. So I already have a good idea of what I need to be looking at as part of whatever the scope has been applied to. And of course, I'll always do a quick refresh, reread of the standard, because I by no means know this standard backwards, forwards. And I think with everything, it's always really difficult to be able to learn it. So a quick reread, and even looking, if I think there's a gap in the documents, I'll have a look and try and tie it to a standard to begin with. Not that I'm saying it's definitely going to be a finding, but I like to be able to present. If I think there's a gap, I'll present the gap and show the customer what it says in the standard and why I think it's a gap, and then give them the right to reply. I love a bit of challenging just to see if they want, you know, so I'm by no means coming in with a mind fixed. If they can evidence something or can convince me otherwise, then I'm quite happy for that to happen. So that's all the sort of pre-work. So then we get to the actual day of the assessment, when the assessment team comes strolling in. This is me on my right-hand side here. So I imagine most people probably see us, and I see the teams when they come into my laboratory. But in we come, welcomed with open arms, and we start the assessment. So how do we approach the assessment? So in mine, I've basically tried two different ways. So on my first assessment, what I did was I reviewed the gap analysis and highlighted any of the key things, or knew what I had to look at. And then what I tried to do is sit with a member of the lab team who completed the document, sit through and work through the gaps first. The problem I found with that method was that it meant it was all a bit higgledy-piggledy, and I got a bit lost in how I could then structure the normal, if you like, in inverted commas, technical assessment. So if I was in looking at a full blood count, because that's what I do, hematology, I would be looking at certain bits which were in the gap document. And then when I went in and tried to do the normal technical assessment, I felt I'd lost a bit of flow in how I normally do that. So the second assessment I did, and in between the two assessments, we had our UKAS meeting and found that it was sort of a bit of a split, where some were doing it this way and others were doing effectively exactly what we used to do. So we go out and do the exact same way of technical assessing, but being fully aware that we need to make sure we pick up any of the key highlighted things in the gap analysis. So for me, that one was much better. So I think what I found was it was a much better flow in the visit. So I was just doing what I was comfortable doing, working through for each bits of the scope. I would go through, do all the sort of general technical assessing. What I found was the lab team are more familiar with that approach as well, which is sort of reassuring. Yes, there were some more questions about specific aspects which are out of the 2022 standard, which they may not have been as familiar with, but all tied into a nice little routine where we worked through tests and sort of saw what was going on. For me, though, the key is making so I was graciously given a digital copy of the standard from UKAS as part of my technical assessing, and that is amazing. So I have it on a tablet which I take technical assessing, and our good old friend Control F saves me a lot of the time. So if we're not sure, I can Control F and find the sort of phrase I'm looking for, and it saves a lot of time in the technical assessment. Because ultimately time is one of the key challenges when we're out technical assessing. No matter what we always feel like, I think we would always ask for a minimum of a half day more. Appreciative, especially in my position, that every half day or every quarter costs money, and it's a lot of money. But I think there was a lot of discussion about how pressured time was. So doing a surveillance isn't as bad, but I wouldn't like to do a full reassessment and transition in one. I think that would be quite heavy going, but fortunately, they haven't been offering them up with me, so I'm quite happy with that. So I think Mark sort of covered this one. So it's sort of like a 2012 versus 2022. What are we even looking at? And the answer is kind of both. So as Mark mentioned, so we'll go through the transition visit, but you also get your normal surveillance visit of whatever it is. And we will still have in the back of our minds 2012 and thinking, right, well, are we still happy that they're compliant with 2012? Yes, there may be a gap for 2022, which will raise as part of transition, but we can still look at it to make sure that we're happy that you haven't fallen back with 2012 and are potentially putting your sort of your compliance at risk. And what we can do is we can effectively raise, we used to be a standards and raise findings against either 2012 or 22. However, what we do is we actually find the clause in the new 2022 standard equivalent. So you'll always get that. And as anyone who's been through a visit will do, what we have to do is we have to complete either a portal. So the portal goes for this normal surveillance visit, which is the new UKAS portal. So we'll create our findings in there with the improvement actions, and the transition. I've got that the right way around. No, the transition goes on the old paperwork, I think, which is the spreadsheet one with the findings on. So you'll get them separately. And I've already mentioned that. So that's the sort of thing, how we've worked through it. And just before I move on, I think the key things that I was sort of always aware of, which crosses both of these, is kind of like any gaps you highlight in your risk assess, your sort of gap analysis. If you've written them in and say it's a major one and have done nothing to correct it or sort it out by the time we come in as UKAS, then that effectively will turn into a finding. You've just told us directly about it. And that's part of the thing that Mark's saying about, yes, you've done your gap, but you have to be showing progression. It's not that you have to have everything done. So I think when Mark was talking about validation verification, so from the visit I've had, our microbiology team haven't done a verification of anything recently. There's a few ongoing, but that started before and were sort of in the interim. However, I created a validation verification SOP update, which had all the requirements of 2022 inbuilt with templates, which are to be used for verification plans and reports for the future, to show that the structure was in there so that we knew what we'll have to follow. And that was sort of, that was accepted by the assessment manager to say, well, appreciating we can't just run off a verification just to prove that we would fill that in, but all of it is there and we'll be able to demonstrate it next time. So so as I said, we've just had a visit last month, which was our SU3 visit and transition. So poor Damien, who's sitting pretending to look at a gram stain, who's one of our biomedical scientists. So what did we do? Well, effectively, I've done exactly what Mark said. We had to do a gap analysis review and loads of work on reviewing and updating procedures to ensure all the majors are covered at least. So I went through knowing from technical assessing that that's what we were going to be focusing on. So that's what I made sure we focused on within our lab. So we did a lot of the majors and any of the moderates. Even some of the minors actually were picked up because any quick wins were done as well, but we really did focus on making sure we covered a lot of the majors. And then what we did is work towards getting these processes embedded within our quality management system. So for example, we updated our CAPA template so that we had potential clinical impact, which was a new thing. So that was rolled out and pushed, and we did some education meetings to explain why this was required, and the harder bit, which was informing our clinical teams that they're going to have to get more involved in some of this quality management system stuff, where they may have sort of made a couple of comments in a speciality board or a quality meeting or something, but this was actually fully documenting in a kappa for an issue, that they are aware and what their recommendations are, or them effectively saying there is no clinical impact, so they're happy that they don't need anything further. And also updating competency assessments to include the word authorization to complete tasks and writing new competencies which are not in place, for example, validation verification. So all this documentation got created. By no means is everybody in my laboratory who does validation verification, plan writing, reporting, they don't have it filled out, but we have made progress with some having evidence so that it's being done. And so that was accepted as well, to say, so we're showing that we're moving in the right direction. Sent the gap analysis pre-visit. We submitted all the usual documents into the portal/SharePoint. I think it's supposed to go in the portal, but for some reason for me, it wasn't working. So we managed to get the stuff. And just be aware that there is extra effort as part of a transition for the department. So that's an additional cost just for this sort of time. But what was my experience? So overall, so we are infectious disease and pregnancy screening. So we had to have a half-day visit as part of that. There was no change really. It's just filling out the standard gap analysis, standard sort of spreadsheet for the evidence for that. And then when we sat and had our visit, I sat with my assessment manager and for probably the first 3/4 of a day worked through our gap analysis, highlighting, pulling documents up out of QPulse, which is our quality management system, discuss the embedding of the new standard and show compliance. And the key thing is about being able to have these documents at hand and quite quickly so that we don't waste time looking for things. So when they're asking to see something, I knew where it was and it was there. And I use QPulse now, where you can do relating standards. I don't know if people out there use QPulse in that way, but you can build the entire standard into QPulse and then relate every single document to any standard you want, and that's very handy. And after we did that, we then had to do what felt like quite a whistle-stop tour of our normal surveillance visit, where we would then start going through some of the normal bits, going through I think like competence and the management requirement stuff as part of the normal visit as well. So overall, I think for our microbiology department, it's about a 1.5 day visit we had, and we got 5 findings. So we're below the average of 14. So I'm pretty happy with that. And I'd like to think that some of that is probably due to the fact that I play both sides of the field, so I get to see what I need to look at and focus on more, and that gives my department, which is effectively why I do UKAS assessing, is to try and make it easier for my department, so I get the experience to do the assessing, see what's being looked at, see what the key issues are, and I can come back and go, we need to focus on X, Y, and Z. So we have 2 related to the new standard as part of transition, and 3 which is just part of the routine. And funnily enough, ERG was one of ours, about being able to demonstrate compliance, but we've had a couple of instances anyway, but I guess it was more about testing people to make sure they knew what they were doing. Obviously, we've got 4 weeks to clear, all including the transition-based findings, so we don't get any more time. So just in case anyone thought it was going to be 12 weeks of transition, it's not. It's just standard 4. So just picking up on a couple of the things that Mark had mentioned. So one of the things that I've had a look at recently was audit-based risk, and looking at the audit calendar, which I'd planned out for about 4 years in advance. What I did is did a review, and how I went about it for our lab is basically pulled a list of all the CAPAs or findings based on any audits, and then managed the calendar around that. So if, for example, in haematology, we'd done an audit on the full blood count process for every year for 4 years, and we didn't really find anything. However, we had a problem with the SOP. Every time they reviewed it, they weren't updating the paper copy, so the version number was wrong. What I then did is thought, well, I'm going to take that audit out, because there's no point auditing good practice, but where the bad practice is, which is the document review, we'll put more document reviews in to sort of cover that. So I've manipulated the calendar to fit in with what findings we're getting, and that's now being documented as a CAPA. So next time assessment manager comes, when they ask how we do it, I can present the CAPA and go, well, here's the review, this is what I did and why I did it, and there you go, evidence all there. And just another thing that Mark was saying about, like, where we are still finding things which are more surprising, going out technical assessing. And I think I sometimes go out and go, you know, I've been to a lab recently where they haven't got a measurement certainty for what they should have done, and it is probably falling under the sampling exercise. So as every you know, this is a sampling exercise, and you know, there may be non-conformity elsewhere, and just because we haven't found it doesn't mean it's not there, sort of thing. But what's key and important for me, so as a technical assessor, is when I get the evidence back, is the cause and extent. So we may get a finding to say, oh, you haven't done something. So what you do is you go, all right, oh, well, I'll fix that something, and that's it. But what some are not very good at is then under cause and extent going, well, what else how else could that be affected, and looking at that and going, it's effectively almost like you having to audit. So one of our ones is about closure of CAPAs, so I've had to go and do an audit on all of the open CAPAs, so I can then evidence it to say, right, we've got all these CAPAs that are open, we've reviewed them all, have updated target dates, put reasons why they are, or we'll close them, or doing this. And that's like, so you may just say, oh, this one CAPA I've had a problem with, but then I've had to then review another 25 or whatever it may be. So you've got to bear in mind, it's always that sort of, it's almost like the hidden work when you sort of raise and then find and you go, what else am I going to have to do with it? So just to say, so there's usually when I'm rejecting a evidence supplied, it's not actually for the finding, it's more the fact that they haven't fully considered cause and extent. So that's my sort of summary from my side. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jonathan. That's really helpful. Really good to hear kind of both sides of the coin as well. So from you being a technical assessor, but then how you have put that into practice. And Mark, I suppose it would be remiss of us at this stage, because Al reminds me with some level of regularity to put a shout out for people who may be interested in becoming a technical assessor, and to get in touch with colleagues at UKAS, because there are always rules and requirements for people to join the team and support the technical assessment side of things. I think Jonathan's beautifully highlighted there how poacher turned gamekeeper, or gamekeeper turned poacher, I'm not sure which way around it is, but how being a technical assessor, one of the key benefits is the learning that you can bring back into your own departments to support that ongoing continual quality improvement, and share the learning more broadly. Obviously, from a confidential point of view, Mark, we should always just caveat with that.
It's actually worth mentioning, Debra, that you know, with our technical assessor base, we did have a lot of assessors who retired with the implementation of the new standard. People who've been assessing a long time and just didn't want to move to that next step, which is, you know, we've lost a lot of knowledge there. But on the other side of the coin, we have had an awful lot of new applicants. All disciplines. I mean, I obviously, as you say, microbiology is the best one. I look after the microbiology assessors. We have got a lot of microbiology assessors going through the minute, so it's very encouraging. So yeah, I'd absolutely encourage people to do it, and I do say so myself.
Excellent. Thanks ever so much, Mark. Please do keep the questions coming, folks, either through the Q&A at the top of the screen or in the chat. I'm not bothered. I'll pick them up both ways. So while you're thinking of those questions, and if there's anything specific that you've either come up against during an assessment visit or in preparation whilst you're doing your gap analysis, now is your opportunity. So use and abuse our two assessors today, because that's what they're here for. In the meantime, Mark, would you like to move into the world of LIMS and the delight that we're all going through at the moment in moving into a new laboratory information management system?
Not really, but I will.
Having just transitioned to WinPath Enterprise ourselves here in Northumbria, yeah, we were delighted that we got through with no particular findings, one finding around our LIMS. But yeah, I think it's something that there are a lot of questions about. So good luck.
Thank you very much for that. Start this up. See that okay there? Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. Yeah, I was asked to do a talk on the ISO 15199 transition, and then the LIMS got thrown in there as well somehow. So yeah, thrown to the wolves a little bit, especially seeing as my IT knowledge is very much limited to the Xbox and the PS5 that I have downstairs. So slightly challenging to this, but I have done a number of assessments of the LIMS, so hopefully got some information that will be useful here. A very brief agenda, so just looking at some general comments around assessment of the LIMS, and then some general things which can be considered as you know, when you are making changes to the system. So we're talking about the transition today. So as far as this information management goes, nothing has actually changed with the move to 2022. So the clause has changed. It now sits under clause 7.6, and the wording has been slightly changed. I think it just talked about information management before. So this used to sit right at the very back of the 2012 standard. So it's just been moved forward. But really, all the areas of this are pretty much rated as minor in the gap analysis document that everyone's doing. So really, not a lot of transition assessment needed as regards the LIMS systems. But as you say, there are lots of changes going on within LIMS. Now, certainly over the last year or two, the focus of many people's attention has been on Gen 6, which has been a bit of a thorn in most people's sides, I think, really. This is all about really being very clear when work is done under accreditation. The principles of this apply to both paper and electronic reports. There are some comments in there that actually, and this one's always a little bit unclear to people, myself included, about when you're adding data directly into a database, but it doesn't actually constitute a report. So there is a bit of a risk there of, you know, at what point does a report become a report, and at which point is it just some data? But I don't know that we do see too many instances of that, to be honest. It's really all about accredited work and non-accredited work being identified on reports. That's the key area with this. We are certainly now starting to see, you know, we're seeing more networks and things. I'll touch on this a little bit later. So we're seeing more results being accumulated into a single report, which can make this a little bit more complicated when there are some non-accredited tests on there. Some laboratories within their user information do like to say that when they're seeking accreditation for tests, but there's not really a specific need to do that. I think some labs just like to do it because then it looks like they are seeking accreditation for it. I wouldn't be surprised if there's any questions on Gen 6 at the end, but it is an area that is still presenting some difficulty. The other document worth mentioning is TPS 37, which is a UKAS technical policy statement, and this is around simplified test reports. What this is basically saying is that you don't necessarily need to have all the information as required by the standard on a test report if it's explicitly agreed with users. If you've got a service agreement with your users and they tell you what they want in reports, then you can tweak those reports a little bit to include the information that they want you to. It is worth bearing in mind that if there is information that's not on there, on that report, if it's missed off for whatever reason, then you do need to have that information somewhere. But it is a way of simplifying the assessment. I don't think it's used too often in medical labs, actually. It was updated following Gen 6, and so it's really still saying that Gen 6 actually does still take sort of the priority in many regards, so you still need to make very clear references to you need to work that's accredited and not accredited. For anyone who is familiar with 17025, there's things in there called deviations, and I think this TPS 37 is sort of aimed at that. So a bit less applicable to med labs, but it is something worth bearing in mind. And one example I've seen in the past is if you've got a multi-site network, you know, the standard implies that you need to identify the laboratory that's released the report. Well, you may agree with your users that you're not going to do that, and that as long as they're happy that it's done within a network, you don't actually say which lab tested it, they may be happy with that. But we do need to see documented agreements. It needs to be very clearly written that you've agreed that with your users. So it is something to bear in mind. We do still need to keep Gen 6, of course, but something to just consider. Screen seems to have frozen at the minute. Oh, there we go. We'll just make sure that's working. Yeah, sorry, right. So I don't know what happened there. So yeah, who manages IT? Now, often within our laboratories, there's going to be a sort of a laboratory expert. There's always somebody in there who knows the system inside out and can make little bits of changes and things to it, which is great. Very often the main IT department is outside of the laboratory in these standard settings. It's worth bearing in mind that there is a clear statement in 2022 that it does say that the laboratory is responsible for its own LIMS. So even where there is an external IT department who may have responsibility for managing this, it is the laboratory's responsibility. We cannot just say it's nothing to do with us, it's the IT department who sort that out. There are some laboratory services that have got their own dedicated IT departments. They're often private ones, but I have seen some with a central presence in a standard laboratory. This can make it easier to assess. If the IT department is available and handy, close to the laboratory, that makes the assessment much easier, because we do need to speak to people in IT sometimes, and very often we do turn up on an assessment where it's on the assessment plan that IT is going to be covered. But actually there's nobody available. There's nobody in the lab who's available on the day, or the IT person is on holiday, or they're on call last night, or there's nobody available in the central IT department. So please do have a look at your assessment plans, and if it does show that we are assessing this area, then do make sure that there's somebody available if needed. Worthy of a mention of this ISO 27001. I think some people get a bit scared of this. So this is a certification standard, not an accreditation standard. It's all about information security, cyber security, and privacy protection. And similar to ISO, this was updated in 2022 as well. It goes a little bit further now, because obviously we've had issues in the last few weeks around cyber security. So there's a lot more focus on this now. Now, it's worth bearing in mind, we're not assessing to ISO 27001 when we do our 15189 assessments, but for the eagle-eyed might have seen that it is directly referenced in the 2022 standard, just saying that some of the principles may be useful, and there's extra information within ISO 27001. The reason it's important is that even though we're not assessing it directly, it's always worth checking if your own IT department does have the certification to the standard, because it does cover many of the elements of that we're looking at with 15189, and you can almost take it as an assurance that if that certification is there, then your IT system is going to be fit for purpose in terms of security and those aspects. I've been to a number of labs over the years where their IT department does have this. We do need to see, it's a little bit like your ISO 15189 schedule, in the sense that you can list specific sites that are covered by that accreditation. This standard is the same. So if you've got a certification to this ISO 27001, you can have specific sites assessed on there. And you may see a multi-site service, a multi-site laboratory that has this, and those individual laboratories are covered within that certification. That it doesn't mean that we don't need to assess against 15189, but if I go into a laboratory and I know that laboratory has got this certification, then I can be fairly assured that actually, in terms of the security aspects of it, it's fit for purpose. So do check with your IT departments to see if they have this, because it can be very helpful, and have the information available to the assessors, and perhaps even their last report if you've got that. So some of the things to consider. We are seeing some comments recently from various places, from assessors and from laboratories, about IT departments deciding the content of reports, and this fits in with what I was saying on the previous slide, that the LIMS is owned by the laboratories. It's not anybody else's responsibility. So anyone, if you do have external IT departments who are getting involved, then you do need to cooperate with them. You do need to work with them in terms of making sure the report formats are correct, and everything is working in terms of the IT system. You know, I appreciate that you're the ones who are accredited for this, and it can be difficult to get their cooperation, but you do need to work to make sure that you work as a single team with this. We're also starting to see more results getting issued directly to patients. I think this sort of kicked off a little bit more during the pandemic with the COVID testing results getting sent out directly to patients. The reports may be suitable, though they may have all the required information on there, but there is these new clauses within the 2022 standard now. So I've written 7414D there. This is around not communicating results directly to patients without giving them the opportunity for counselling as needed. So that's really, you know, it speaks for itself. It's really just being very careful what results are issued directly. I think this may be something that's perhaps more common overseas than it is in this country. I've been to some overseas assessments where you do see patients walking into laboratories and then walking out with their own results and things. So it certainly is a thing overseas in some countries, less so in this country, but I think we are moving in that direction. So we do need a little bit of caution with that. And there's also something in 2022 as well about the provision of results for epidemiological purposes. So patients now need to be aware when their results are being shared in that way. So the most obvious one, if you're looking at microbiology, where you may have notifiable diseases, salmonellas, things like that, it's really making sure your service users are aware that information can be passed on to people such as UKHSA for epidemiological purposes. And then as we increase our multi-site services, really making sure that everybody has got access to IT systems. You know, we sometimes see gaps in this, or you can't get pupils from this site, or you can't access whatever system. Sometimes clinical staff may struggle to get onto their systems and need phone calls, needing to ring up laboratories to get results and things. So really, we do need to make sure that IT systems are accessible to everybody. Some other key things to look at now on the next couple of slides. So verification, one of our favourite subjects, of course. Any changes to your existing LIMS system need to be verified. So this may be software changes, or it could be hardware changes. It's really making sure that the reports have still got the correct information. Calculations are there. They're actually giving out the correct results. Any rounding up of figures, decimal places and things. It's the initial verification. It's important to do these, obviously, but also following any updates. I have seen instances where a seemingly minor software changes occur, but it's actually affected something down the line, and you might find the formatting of the results being changed, or the units disappear, or something like that. So do make sure that with any change to a system that you actually make sure you do a level of verification for that. And assessors will look for these. I mean, I've seen these a number of times during things like change controls, and I might just turn up and see a change control that's been done, or we've updated the software to version 10. Okay, can you show me the verification report for that, please? So do make sure that you are aware of any areas where you need to do a verification. And similarly, this is especially for any new LIMS systems, we need to make sure that the verification includes full end-to-end testing. This is all the way from requesting to reporting. So test requesting from example, from a GP surgery or whatever system they're using, going into the laboratory LIMS, getting booked in, making its way to the analyzer, and then all the way back again to where it started. We do need to see that full end-to-end testing to make sure there's no issues occurring along the line there. You know, that whatever tests a GP request, that you are getting that request correctly. It might only be your own LIMS system that's changed. The actual end user system may be completely unchanged, and they might have been in place for many years, and so you think, actually, yeah, they've not changed, so therefore it's okay. But yeah, it may well be that some updates to your system may affect another system down the line. But definitely for a new LIMS system, we will certainly need to see full end-to-end testing. And I've seen lots of good examples of this. I think generally some of the IT departments certainly I've been to have really got quite a good handle on this. Sometimes as an assessor, I can be given a 150-page report, you know, of the actual verification. So very well detailed. Now, you know, none of us are IT experts. I'm certainly not an IT expert. And so, you know, I will look at the verification reports, and we can only really make an informed opinion as to whether it's been done correctly, you know, by looking at things like screenshots, just getting the general impression that the IT department or the laboratory have just covered all angles, you know, and including screenshots. I'm talking about doing the full end-to-end testing, but having screenshots of every single stage that you've done from when it was requested to when it was reported, and things like that will show that you've actually done this properly and that the full pathway is working. So yeah, do bear that in mind. If these verification reports are very large and very long, doesn't matter, you know, as long as they're available to the assessors to have a look at. Backup systems and continuity. So I mentioned continuity in the previous presentation. Contingency plans. Important also to make sure that your contingency plans do include the IT systems. I say this has been on the news sort of recently. Laboratories needing to go back to paper-based systems. We're very good at doing contingency testing for things like, you know, fire, flood, that kind of thing, which may well affect the LIMS system. But do bear in mind that you need to consider that. In terms of things like backup systems, so many laboratories might have off-site servers. You know, you might see this especially in a private laboratory maybe, or private service that's got its own IT department, or they may contract out the IT services to another provider. So do ask about how backup works. You know, things like mirrored servers. I never fully understand what a mirrored server is, but really having a look at how you back up your data so you don't lose anything. Again, I've seen some examples where this is done very well. It's also important to test your backup. So, you know, it's all very well backing up your data every few hours or every day or whatever, but have you done any audits to check that actually you can restore that data, so that if your system does go down, yes, you've got the backups there, but can you recover those backups and do they work? Because we have seen instances in the past where backups have been done, but when somebody gets the backup tapes out and tries to restore the data, it's corrupted or it's not working. And I mentioned, you know, contracting out some of these services to other parties. So bear in mind that any third party involved in your IT system needs to be considered as a supplier as any other. Same as a supplier of your equipment and reagents. So you would determine their suitability to do whatever they're doing for you, making sure you've got robust data protection and confidentiality agreements in place. There's a much bigger focus on that now. And this is where ISO 27001 can come in useful. There's a lot of information there around data protection and this kind of thing. And then, as I just written at the end there, making sure that your contingency testing does include your IT systems. Authorised access to IT systems. I mentioned before, again, in 2022, there's this competency assessment thing now for authorisation, for verifications and use of the IT system. It's really having good systems in place to prevent unauthorised access. So having good password controls, making sure they're updated at intervals. One that I often like to look at is staff who've left the organisation. So, you know, if I'm looking at personnel on an assessment as part of the QMS, I may well want to see that actually someone who's left the organisation recently, their access to the system has been removed. Obviously, they'll still need to remain on the system in terms of audit trail purposes, but it is worth checking that there is a process to prevent access for staff who've left the organisation. Some of these may seem basic things, but, you know, logging off your terminals when you're away from the bench. You know, I appreciate there's going to be a degree of pragmatism here where you might just walk away to go and get a reagent and then come back. frequently, you know, walk around labs and seeing unattended laptops and desktops and PCs and things turned on, nobody there, and then when you ask where that person is, they've gone for the lunch or something. So do bear that in mind. It's not unheard of for the staff to start using people's passwords to do things. So I talked about authorization for making changes, but audit trails when you're making changes. So whoever's making any changes to the IT system, you know, is there a record of traceability to show who has actually made that change, and making sure that that person is authorized to make that change, and that they are considered, they are trained and competent in the use of that system. Use of external devices. This seems to be getting more and more restricted now. There's a lot of places not using USB sticks anymore and things, being very careful with laptops. So, you know, in terms of how the standard works, I know this has been a little bit more focused on LIMS systems and implementing your own LIMS systems, but this does, you know, the standard does talk about data in general. Certainly, you know, we at UKAS all use laptops, and we have quite strict rules in place about how to use them. You know, we're not allowed to leave them in your car, things like that. So do bear that in mind as well. You know, it does go beyond the actual main LIMS that you're using. And as a final point, just to bear in mind that this whole discussion about information management does include paper records as well. You know, yes, we've all moved over to electronic systems in by and large, but there are still lots of paper records in some laboratories, an awful lot in some. For anyone who may have been through an ISO 27001 certification, I've not been through one myself, but I do understand that they even go as far as looking through bins and checking that there's no confidential paper and things in there. So yeah, anything around data management, do remember that includes paper records as well. So just as a summary, yeah, there's been no significant changes within 2022 as regards IT systems and data management. It's all very much the same. They're just minor changes, but we are seeing a larger focus now on data protection and cyber security. It is worth checking if you've got any local ISO 27001 certification, checking that it applies to the laboratory. If it doesn't, perhaps see whether it can be or not. It's certainly not mandatory. We're certainly not assessing against it, but it can go a long way to supporting the suitability of your own IT systems. But the key thing is really making sure that whenever you've got any changes to your IT system, you fully verify them as needed, making sure that all your end-to-end systems are there, any external systems, any external parties, all get involved to demonstrate that the system is doing what it needs to. And do let UKAS know if you have any changes to your system, because it may require specific assessment. It may not be an ETS specifically, but you may have updated a system, in which case we'll think, okay, next time we come on site, we'll make sure that we look at IT. We'll generally do it sort of once in the cycle, data management, but we could actually move it to an earlier assessment if you've made a specific change. But certainly, I would imagine that a new IT system, generally, we will probably do that, not necessarily as an ETS, but there will probably need to be some dedicated effort for us to look at that, because it will require a review of some possibly quite lengthy verification reports. And that's everything. Myself.
Thanks ever so much, Mark. Once again, loads of really useful information in there, and really a key reminder that IT systems are for life. They're not just for Christmas. So change control, change management, and continually staying in touch with your assessment managers around changes that you're making to the system are absolutely critical. So Jonathan, are you still knocking about in the background as well? Just because we do have some questions. So I'll plough through a few of those now. I'll maybe start with the LIMS ones first, just because they're fresh in our head. And Jonathan, I know you've been frantically typing some responses as well. So let's have a look at where we're up to. So I think one of the key ones at the beginning, Mark, was how does the responsible for LIMS bit work when you're a networked organisation? So you may have 4 or 5 trusts using a single LIMS, but they all have their own accreditation number. How does that responsible for LIMS bit work? Oh, you're on mute.
I'm mute, sorry about that, yeah. So this is different accreditation numbers, is it, altogether, and different organisations?
Different accreditation numbers.
Yeah.
Different organisations potentially in a network, but one LIMS system across the patch.
Yeah, I mean, it would have to be very clearly demonstrated who has got responsibility for that system. You know, it may be that one party looks after it all. It may be that there are multiple parties looking after it. But I think it will be absolutely essential that somebody retains the overall control of that, and this would need to be clearly documented within some sort of service agreements. You know, really spelling out very clearly who takes responsibility for it, and who's looking after the system, who's going to respond to any requests for changes, that kind of thing. That would be the most important area to consider there, I would think.
Yeah, it's the governance really. What's the governance that you have in place to be able to manage and then onwardly look after that system, and who's kind of the host organisation for change and change management?
And it may well be there are some individual people at very specific sites who've got, I mean, it'd probably be nice in those situations to think that at a given site there is somebody who's responsible for that site who feeds into the bigger picture. So, you know, it may be that you'd want to have an organisational structure as you know, a dedicated organisational structure, as well as your agreements to show exactly who is doing what.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. We'll stay on the LIMS theme just for a little while. Okay. So it's a similar one in relation to networks, because obviously a lot of the funding has been made available for networks to deploy new LIMS. So where LIMS are coming in across networks, does UKAS anticipate each individual lab or UKAS number within the network to have all the evidence of user acceptance testing, staying away from that 3-letter acronym there, user acceptance testing, validation and verification? Or will you consider accepting high-level acceptance at network level instead of everyone having to submit everything separately?
Oh, interesting one. Yeah, it's a little bit like multi-site, isn't it? It's the same sort of situation. So, I mean, if these are completely different accreditation references, completely different standalone laboratories, but one organisation is looking after the system, in theory, each laboratory would need to have its own records. I mean, I would imagine in these situations that although there may be some central verification, if you like, some central high-level documentation there would also be some local level documentation as well. And so I think it will be useful for the assessor to be able to see that higher level central document, but also the ones relevant to the specific site. Now, the difficulty then comes in as to whether each of those laboratories would need to submit an extension to scope or whatever, or there will certainly each individual need to make the assessors or make UKAS aware that this change has been done. Using the old UKAS phrase, I would have to say it depends. I mean, we would look at each case on an individual circumstance. It always feels like I get out when we say it depends, but it honestly does. You know, you would just look at each one on a case-by-case basis. I have seen some situations where we've got an organisation with different accreditation references, but very closely related, who are making one change together. And it might be that you can agree that change is looked at for one of the sites, but applied to all of them, if you know what I mean. We've often done that with changes of analyzers and things. So, you know, so it might be one lab does an ETS and the others all piggyback onto it. So there's certainly possible that something like that could be done in that way. But we certainly would have to look at each case individually to see the circumstances.
I think, Mark, the advent of networks and network ways of working are throwing up just as many questions for you guys at UKAS as they are for us delivering it on the ground as well. So
absolutely.
Whilst nobody really likes the "I'm not really sure" answer, we're still in that period of settling into new ways of working around the country, aren't we? So we shall see what happens.
Yeah, there are lots of these networks developing, and they've all got their own little quirks. They've all got their own little ways in which they work. I mean, you might have some that are very well established, been going for a long, long time, and that may give you a different level of expectation and confidence from one that started 3 months ago, because you don't know how that one's working in practice. So it's things like that we need to factor into this.
Justification and assurance, the buzzwords that we always need all the way through. Last one from a LIMS point of view. How do you advise evidence and competency to a new LIMS, which is still constantly changing every week? Jonathan, I don't know whether you want that one, possibly, because we're living it.
I'll put a little thing on that one. So I think from my reviews, but I think from what we've done, so we were very lucky. So our trust developed a online training course for the new LIMS and our new ICE system, as it happens, through like our ESR system. So that sort of forms the basis of the fundamental operation of the system. And then what we did is created a competency assessment at that level to say that so what we did is pick some of the more of the basic functions. So we're not going into the minutiae of the actual system and saying you can do a very specific function, but you can do booking in of patients' requests, etc., and you understand authorization or work lists or whatever sort of quite generic areas. Because if we had gone down the fundamentals of going, and you know exactly how to do this thing, and then it changes and changes, I think you'd be sort of stuck in this perpetual loop of constantly having to re-competency assess. So for me, we kept it quite generic for now, and then we will get to a point where once there's a period of stability, soon may that come, then we can possibly look at updating that generic competency. But that's how I would approach it, and I think even as a UKAS assessor, I feel I'd have to be fairly understanding that you're in a period of flux. So long as there's something to demonstrate competence with the system as is, I would be happy.
Mark, do you have anything to add to that one? Are you happy?
Yeah, I think agree with Jonathan. I think it's really down to labs to identify what you need to start using it. What are the key aspects of this LIMS, so that you've done the training competency in those areas, but you're aware that you're making changes all along. As long as you keep a record of those changes that are being made and show that you are phasing in the training and competency of those areas, that will, I would imagine, that will be sufficient. It's just about showing that you're in control of it and that you're aware of things and you know what's going on. That just gives an assessor confidence. If you walk into a lab and they're flapping around, they don't know, I haven't thought of that, suddenly you lose a little bit of confidence. So when people understand it, can explain it to you, it counts for an awful lot on an assessment. That.
Great, thank you. Should we do a couple that specifically relate to your comments around direct patient reporting and the responsibility for counselling of that patient. So a couple of questions have come in. Regarding reporting results directly to patients, does UKAS deem the lab responsible if the result is sent to the requester's system and then forwarded to the patient app? I think in most cases that we're starting to see that's a common way of results hitting a patient application, or the NHS app as an example, if their GP has signed up to it. So it goes through their normal GP resulting and then into an app.
Yeah, I mean, we started seeing things like this during the pandemic, and it was very much about looking at what service. So with things like the COVID sampling, for example, people would send the COVID sample into a laboratory. They would then do the testing. Now, I would expect the laboratory to issue that result in accordance with ISO 15189. If the subsequent organisation then decides to remove things from that report and change it in any way, then that will be concerning. But of course, it's not really the lab's responsibility in that respect. And as long as the labs do what they need to do and it's written into their agreements, I would also actually like to see, really, in that situation, that a lab has something in the agreement to tell this other provider that they will not amend the reports. That would seem to me to be quite useful as well, so that if somebody does subsequently change it, the lab could say, well, that's not our responsibility in a way like that. But I would certainly expect the lab to be responsible to that point.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's that ensuring the result that we send out is the result that is then acted upon, and it's not changed or altered in any way. I think some of the other issues that we've seen nationally with results appearing on an app is that they aren't the most visually pleasing or understandable, and how we report things like reference ranges or out of range tests, and that they're still understandable to the end user, be that patient or anyone else. I think this is going to be another changing world that we're going to have to keep an eye on over the coming months, but certainly one that both UKAS and IBMS will help you try and navigate as much as we can. Fab. Slightly easier one for you. And Jonathan, I know you've picked this one up in the chat as well, but can biomedical scientists help with verification and validation of equipment and processes in the department? I'm going to answer this one first and say not only can they, but they should be helping with validation and verification of equipment and processes in the department, as should anybody that interfaces with that equipment or process. But the magic words are, as long as they are trained and competent to do so. And that's the important bit. Mark, Jonathan, do you want to add anything?
No, absolutely right. I think it's for everyone to get involved with, and you know, I think from going on UKAS assessments, what I always like to see is the UKAS assessment is not about the seniors and it's not about consultants, it's about everybody. And it's always nice to go to see laboratories, closing meetings, opening meetings, getting some of the BMSs involved in it, and not just the seniors. So yeah, very much getting everybody, because the BMSs working in a lab today, they're the seniors of the future and the like. So it is important to get everybody involved for sure.
And potentially your future assessors. So
exactly, yeah.
Get them started young is is my advice. Last question, very aware that we've only got 3 minutes to go, and this one's very, very specific. So hematological malignancy lab that sits within cell path, so straddles both histo and hematology, and often by the sounds of it, you guys will only receive either a histopathology assessor or a hematology assessor. And are there plans for UKAS to have specific assessors for niche services like this one?
Ooh,
that's a good one, isn't it? There's always one that we like to give you.
Wasn't as, yeah, I mean, we have got some areas where there are some very niche areas at the minute where there are not necessarily any assessors who are familiar with that. Now, in some cases, we do sometimes use technical experts. These are people who are not necessarily an assessor. They're not familiar with 15189, but they are familiar with their area. We do have to use technical experts from time to time. The disadvantage to the lab in that case is that we need a lead assessor to go with them, so you're doubling up the number of people, which obviously doubles the cost as well. So we can get around it in that regard of using technical experts. Where there are some areas where we feel that we need to get assessors in, then we can certainly work on that. We do have this requirement of assessors doing sort of 3 assessments a year. We need to make sure that they keep their competencies up. So if you've got a lab where there's only 1 or 2 in the whole country doing it, then it can be difficult for the assessors to maintain their competence in assessing. So in those situations, we do tend to use technical experts. But as some of these areas grow, then certainly we would look at training assessors in those areas.
That's great. Thanks, Mark. Sam, you raised that question. I think that's possibly have you considered being an assessor yourself to help with some of this? And if you haven't, what about being a technical expert? We know we have challenges across other areas like toxicology as a good example as well. Anyway, huge thank you to both Mark and Jonathan. If everyone could unmute, I'm sure they would, and give you a round of applause. So I'll do it on behalf of them. Thank you ever so much, guys. It's been hugely informative, and I hope it's helped our members just that little bit more. It will be available on the IBMS website for those of you who haven't been able to join today, or please share with your colleagues so that they can also gain the benefit of hearing some of not only the presentations but the Q&As as well. And finally, thanks to you guys. We can't do it without you, so thank you for your questions and your participation all the way through. Just a gentle plug for the next session, which is slated for the 4th of September, same slot at 1 o'clock, and that's point of care testing and the transition away from 22870 and into 15189. And I'm sure John Ringrow will give us a fantastic session on that one. I have put in the chat, if there are any other specific areas that you feel would be of benefit, please let us know at the Institute, and we will work alongside colleagues in UKAS to help deliver those sessions as well. Otherwise, thank you ever so much for your time and joining us today, and we'll see you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.